They named her Curse and left her in the sands, but the desert returned her to those who dared to face the truth. She learned to sip hope in small gulps, and one day offered it to the whole town. How did a girl who was meant to die manage to change thousands of lives? What's the saying? Oh, well, howdy, stranger. Old Jack at your service, though the only service I've got is flapping my gums and telling how things used to be. Who am I, you ask? Well, maybe I was a gunslinger. Maybe I was the one stacking the deck. Or maybe I was just pouring whiskey for the fellas doing the dirty work. But that ain't why you're here, is it? Nah, you're here to hear a story. So lean in. The desert keeps time different than towns do. It counts in storms survived and shadows forgiven. Years later, when thunderheads stacked like courthouse steps on the horizon, the girl came back wearing a woman's coat and a doctor's steadiness. East had taught her Latin names for pains the West already knew in plain speech. She brought both languages and used the one that healed fastest. The town pretended not to stare and failed kindly. The storekeeper's wife fussed over hems again and found nothing to fix. The judge shook a hand that could hold a suture and a stubborn truth at once. The writer said, "Welcome home," the way men say grace, brief, honest, and enough. The clinic behind the feed store lost its shyness. Windows cleaned themselves, or so it seemed. A plank got planed. A sign went up, plain as bread, Dr. Evangeline Whitmore. She saw to births and busted ribs, to miners who had swallowed too much night, to children who had swallowed too many daredevil afternoons. She spoke soft or sharp as the wound required, and let no one use the word cursed in her rooms unless they meant their own temper. Some evenings, she walked the old trails as if listening for a younger voice that had once called into a hot wind. When the wind answered, it sounded like horses turned out at dusk, like knives sheathed, like doors that open because they want to. The thin man tried one last time to find an angle that made him taller than his choices. He came by day, because cowards confuse light with safety. He brought a paper, a complaint wrapped in law's clothing, and a smile that asked the town to forget what it knew. No guns this time, no shouting. The writer met him at the threshold of the clinic, where the floorboards had learned how to hold people steady. The judge stepped out from a chair inside with the posture of consequences. The sheriff leaned on a post like patience in a hat. The thin man held out his paper and found out what every bad architect learns eventually. A house built of lies collapses under the weight of one good witness. He left with less than he brought. That's the only honest ending for men like him. Seasons did their work. Calves were born into mornings that smelled like wet earth and hay. The clinic's ledger thickened with names and small victories. A boy who would have lost his leg lost only a limp. A mother who would have lost her breath found it again and used it to sing. A miner laid down whiskey long enough to pick up a pen and write home. Not miracles, just good work done in order. The grandmother's hair went full winter, then gentle to spring again in the stories she sent. She came when she could, sat by the window where light made lace of dust, and told the doctor about cities that heal by stacking kindness in tall buildings. The West answered by setting 2 chairs on a porch and offering a sky big enough for fear and hope to sit together without elbows touching. One night, a storm walked in from the far mesas with boots full of rain. Lightning stitched the valley mouth to mouth. The writer and the doctor sat quiet, counting the seconds between flash and rumble the way a body measures the distance to forgiveness. "Do you ever think on the day we met?" she asked, not looking at him in case the answer wore tears. "Every time the wind lifts right," he said. "Every time I hear a door creak honest. Every time I see a child run without looking back." She told him then about a plan that had more courage than comfort in it. A training room. Books with pictures of bones open to anyone who could hold a pencil and a promise. Women first, because no one else was inviting them. Then whoever came ready to be useful. She said the town could be more than a place where cattle changed hands. It could be where futures did. He listened the way men do when they're being given a job that doesn't end at the hands. "Build it," he said. "I'll fetch lumber. Others will fetch more. Out here, consent isn't loud. It hitches a team and shows up at dawn." They built. Hammer songs rang until the hills learned the tune. The first class sat on benches, still smelling of sap, and wrote their names like oaths. The doctor taught pulse as music, and fever as a thief you catch by counting. She taught stitches as handwriting, and told them that steadiness is a muscle, not a miracle. The rider kept the stove fed and the roof tight, and pretended not to listen while he listened to everything. Law came by and watched from the door, hat in hand, knowing order isn't just jails. It's places where people learn not to need them. In time, folks started telling the story the way the West always has. Wrong in the details, right in the bones. About a child carried out of a desert that had decided to keep her, and a man who decided otherwise. About papers that tried to steal what the sun had witnessed, and a judge who asked the truth to sign its name. About a thin man who mistook fear for fate, and a woman who learned to call both by their proper names and send them to bed without supper. They told it on porches and over fence rails, and in the hush before a birth cry. They changed the name sometimes, out of politeness or forgetfulness, but the heart stayed steady. The desert takes much. It does not take everything. And when the night finally came for the rider to lie easy and the town to walk softer for a while, the doctor sat by his bed, not as a child saved, but as a woman equal, and took his hand as if returning a loan with interest. He looked at her not with pride exactly. Pride is too small a cup, but with the peace that comes when a man's work recognizes itself, standing at the foot of his bed and nodding. "Keep building," he said, or maybe the wind said it for him. Hard to tell in a room where love had learned to speak in more than one voice. So that's the truth of it. As clean as a bone bleached on high ground. Justice out here doesn't wear a robe as often as it wears calluses. Freedom isn't a shout. It's a gate mended before it sags. Honor is not a speech. It's the quiet decision to stand where a child can find you. The desert keeps secrets, yes. But sometimes, when the sun is kind and the wind forgets to be cruel, it gives one back. And if a man happens to be there with steady hands and a name he's not afraid to share, well, then the West adds a story to the ones it tells at dusk, when even the coyotes hush to hear how it ends. Heard a child's cry once, thin as thread and twice as brave, riding the heat like a hawk that forgot how to land. It came out of the rocks and cactus, out of a sky hammered flat, out of a day so bright it burned the color out of men's eyes. Didn't need to say my name to the wind. The wind already knows too much. I was there. I saw enough to keep me quiet most nights, and talking on the lonelier ones. A rider came along that trail, the slow kind of rider who saves his horse by saving his temper. The mare's breath rasped gentle, like a church door opening on Sunday. He heard the cry too. Stopped, dismounted easy, hands open, like he was approaching a skittish truth. He didn't call out, just listened. The desert hates noise that isn't honest. Behind prickly pear and a bad idea of a path, there she was, little thing, feet like torn paper, dress nothing but a memory, face streaked with dust and dried tears that mapped where hope went looking and lost its way. Her eyes did the rest, green like prairie grass after a lightning strike. Not pretty, not poetic, just alive. "Please," she said, voice rubbed thin on thirst. "Don't let them take me back." Back can mean home, or it can mean a pit with a lid on it. Out here, a child doesn't get that wrong. He gave water slow. A few drops, then a breath, then a few more. Mercy works best like that. She tried to thank him and fainted instead. Bodies know when it's safe to fall. He lifted her, set her on the mare like placing a sparrow on a tree branch and praying it remembers wings. Climbed up, held her steady, not tight. Tight scares, steady saves. She woke to the motion and the sound of leather thinking about its life. "Mama," she whispered, and it cut the rider worse than spurs. They said I'm cursed, said I sour wells, said the devil breathes through me. Men who can't beat the drought beat a child. Seen it too often. They call it fate, so they don't have to spell coward. "What's your name?" he asked, voice low, as if not to spook the truth. "Evangeline," she said. Then, like a secret small enough to fit in pocket, "Evie." Town slid up out of the heat like a bad promise, and with it 3 riders, fast and polished wrong. Clothes too clean for worry. Faces too hard for love. The girl went stiff. "Papa's coming," she said, but there wasn't any home in the word, just the creak of a rope that had learned her weight. The thin man spoke first, teeth sharp on every claim. Said the child wandered, said they'd been searching. But sweat tells on liars, and so do eyes. 15 miles, the rider said even. Long way for small feet to wander. The girl didn't lift her head. Didn't need to. "They left me," she said to the saddle horn. True words don't shout. They just land heavy and stay. The thin man called down curses the way some call down rain. Devil this. Luck that. Crops dying. Hens quitting. He stacked all his failures up and tried to set them on the girl's shoulders. The rider didn't touch his iron. Sometimes the fastest draw is not drawing. He said the sheriff's name like a door closing. The woman flinched. The boy's jaw trembled. The thin man's pride rode out ahead to hide his back. They turned away with threats made of dust. Dust don't keep oaths. The girl asked the sky if she would be kept. The rider didn't lie to her. He just sat straighter, which is a kind of yes you can lean on. Copper Ridge wore evening like a scab. The main street held its breath. The saloon door creaked once, like silence before the storm, then settled back into its hinges and lies. The rider took the girl to the doctor first. Always start where hands are clean and eyes are kinder than the world. The old man poked at wounds with feather fingers and muttered dark about folks who forget children are not cattle to be culled. He said dehydration, exhaustion, but not broken. Bones can be straight. Trust takes longer. They left with bandaged feet and a little tin of hope the color of ointment. At the general store, the owner's wife measured the girl's ankles with thread, the way grandmothers measure rain. She fussed soft, found a blue dress that didn't ask questions and shoes that remembered the shape of mercy. She wrapped the child's fear in talk of hems and buttons until some of the shaking slipped off and hid in the folds. "Orphanage in Phoenix?" someone asked, as if institutions were a kind of hug. "Not tonight," the rider said. The way he said it put a roof over the child, so solid the wind backed away. They rented a room above the boarding house smell of stew. The girl ate like a person who had been told food was a rumor. She fell asleep mid-bite, a small face loosed from its knots. The rider sat in a chair that creaked old stories and watched the window until night forgave the day its brightness. Morning brought work and the necessary treachery of leaving. He took her to the storekeeper's wife with a nod and the kind of coins that say please, not pay. The woman promised to keep the day gentle. Promises like that hold towns together. Word travels out here the way brush fire does. Quick, hungry, always looking for something dry to swallow. By noon the three riders had a story. By sundown they had paper. They came back with stamps and sneers and a sharpened claim. A judge's name inked like a knife. The woman at the store stood her ground. But paper opens doors that gunpowder can't. The girl clawed, cried, begged. Her voice tore on each no like cloth on a nail. They dragged her out anyway. When the rider returned from the mine, he found a chair tipped over, teapot crying on the stove, and a woman with red eyes and a broken apology. Those are landmarks grief never forgets. He didn't curse, didn't shout. He saddled the mare with hands that knew this saddle was about to carry more than one kind of weight. He rode west, where the land puckers into failure and men build their houses on top of excuses. The homestead crouched in a field of dead arguments. Fences leaned like drunks. Chickens kept the kind of silence that means nothing left to lay. A window showed a small face, wet and wide, and that sight made the rider's jaw hard enough to strike a spark. He dismounted, kept his hands visible, announced himself to the dirt, so there'd be no questions later. The thin man came out with a shotgun held like a wedding vow. He wore law on his tongue the way a wolf wears lambskin. "Legal," he said, as if the word were a wall no one could climb. Spoke of favors in Tucson, of signatures that sat up straight and saluted. "Where do you find your ink?" the rider asked, pleasant as a closed fist in a pocket. Inside, the girl cried his name into the boards. The sound of it broke a window in every decent heart for 5 miles. Then the house made its own choice. Smoke curdled from the rear, lazy at first, then busy. Somebody had left a cooking fire, nursing a grudge. Flames licked the roofline, like they'd been waiting on a reason. The woman ran out, coughing out every lie she had ever told. Dragged the child. The child tore free, a wild bird that suddenly remembered sky, and went straight for the only set of arms that had ever felt like staying. The rider lifted her, mounted, turned. Behind him, men shouted at fire the way fools argue with weather. He didn't look back. There are times for witness and times for mercy, and they don't always share a saddle. He rode hard until the town's dust took them in and closed the door. Then he went to a judge with eyes like cold water and a memory for handwriting. 3 weeks. That's how long truth sometimes limps. The judge picked at dates until they unraveled, held signatures up to light until their shadows confessed, and listened to a child talk in a voice that didn't know how to lie. In the end, paper cut the other way. Forgery, he said. Abandonment, he said. Prison, he said. And the words fit the thin man like a coat he had measured for himself. The others were banished by miles, which is the only leash that works on cowards. The judge asked the rider if he meant to keep what the desert had tried to throw away. The rider didn't give a speech, just said yes in a way that sounded like a house being built. The court made it proper, gave the girl his name, like handing her a lantern that won't go out in wind. They walked out into noon, and noon didn't seem so cruel. The storekeeper's wife cried happy and baked a cake that rose like a prayer. The doctor declared the child mended where mending can be done and left the rest to time, which is the only surgeon with steady hands for souls. Nights teach what daylight denies. In that little rented room, the lamp wrote circles on the ceiling while the girl woke drowning in dry air, clawing her way out of dreams that smelled like hot iron and mule sweat. The rider learned to wake before her scream did, to put a hand near but not on, to say her name soft until the world came back piece by piece. He never asked for the dreams. Some stories heal faster when no one makes them walk. Mornings were better. Bread and jam. A tin pail for school. A promise he would come back when the mind spat him out. Promises are fences you mend every day. He mended them. The storekeeper's wife wrapped the girl in chores and gossip, which is how a town tucks a child into a larger bed. The teacher, Miss Collins, saw what the desert had not managed to take, so the girl had a way of setting her small hand on another child's shoulder at the right time, like laying a cool cloth on fever. Kindness done quiet is the only currency that never inflates. The girl learned her letters quick, wrote them stubborn, like each one owed her a truth it could not dodge. In the evenings, the rider and the girl sat on a step that called itself a porch and watched sky colors suffer and soften. She told him about biscuits burned on purpose and called it well done because it made the storekeeper's wife smile. He told her about stars with names and trails that pretend to be roads until they surprise you with the river. Between them, the air felt less empty. But the desert keeps debts on a ledger made of bone, and even good days go to ground when boot heels ring wrong. One afternoon, the rider came back from the mine with hunger in his elbows and dust in his lungs, and found the storekeeper's wife holding news in her apron like a broken bird. They asked questions, she said. A woman, not like the others. Clean money, clean eyes, from back east by the way she spoke, and grieving in a manner that had practice. Grief that wears gloves and knocks on the front door is still grief. It just knows which fork to use. She asked about the day the child was found, about the desert, about names buried under the ash of bad men's choices. The doctor kept his answers true and narrow, the way a man carries water in a cracked bucket. He sent the woman to a judge who could tell ink by its smell and men by their footprints. And then the rider sat at a table and measured the room with his breathing until breathing felt like a promise he could keep. He could run. Plenty of roads pretend to be salvation, but running is a kind of lie you tell your own feet. The girl had lived in lies long enough. He chose to stay. Staying is how houses happen. The woman came at dusk, when doors decide which way they swing. 60 maybe, with hair like winter prairie and a dress that fit sense more than fashion. Her eyes found the girl, and lit from the inside with something that looked like home surviving a storm. She didn't reach too fast, didn't claim too quick. Just said a name, Margaret, the way a church says amen, and told a story that had been walking after its child for 3 hard years. A marriage made on stubborn hope. A husband who found the bottom of bottles faster than the bottom of his shame. A death from coughing that took the good and left the empty. And a sale, $50 in a bottle, made of a child as if she were a saddle. There are prices that take the counting out of a man. The room went still the way rooms do when they need to hold a choice. The girl sat small and straight and asked a question no child should ever have to find a voice for. He sold me. The writer said what men say when truth is a blade that will not spare them. He said the past cannot be purchased back, only buried correct. The older woman nodded as if she had come knowing she would have to agree with pain to be allowed at the table. She said she would not take the child from the only name that had ever held her without shaking. She said she wanted to be a grandmother the way rain wants to be forgiven by the desert. Some folks prove intentions with paper. She brought none. She proved with patience. Letters came regular as phases of the moon. Their ink steady, their story small. Tulips in a city yard, a book stitched with pictures, a music box that sounded like a pocket full of bells. Gifts followed, never heavy enough to bow a child's head, just bright enough to lift her chin. Trust learned to walk beside them, favoring an old wound but willing. By winter, the girl could sleep through most nights. Not all. Some storms shake a house even after the sky clears. But when she woke, she knew where she was without asking, and that knowing is a better blanket than any wool. Spring made promises, and, rare for spring, kept some. The writer's wages stacked into a small wall against hunger. With help from money that did not smell like apology, land became possible. A thin rectangle of earth on the edge of town where wind had less to laugh at. They built a fence that didn't need to keep anything out except the past. The girl learned the sound of a hammer, finding the sweet spot on a nail, and loved it. Building is a hymn that even atheists can sing. They bought 2 cows and named them wrong on purpose, Beauty and Justice, so the world would have to smile when it called them. A horse came later, good-hearted and close to wise. The girl brushed him until his coat held the sunset, and he learned to lower his head when she asked, because some requests aren't orders, even when they sound like them. She started calling the writer Papa, sometime between planting beans and failing at a scarecrow. The word surprised them both, like a bird landing on a shoulder that thought it was only a fence post. He didn't say he loved her. He fixed a hinge before it squealed. He saved the better slice of pie without looking noble about it. Affection wears work clothes out here. At school, the girl carried other children's hurts for a while so they could rest their arms. Miss Collins said she was bright in the way a lantern is bright in a barn, useful first, beautiful after. The judge, who had seen too many names scratch themselves out of ledgers, tipped his hat when she passed, which is how law salutes salvation. But even a quiet season has a coyote at its edge. Word slid along the telegraph and into town that a certain thin man had learned to behave for 2 years and was out, wearing his hate like a new coat. The band held miles in it, but miles were thin when a man is hungry. The writer oiled his rifle without hurry or drama, the way a man sharpens a pencil for a letter he hopes not to write. He taught the girl where to stand when thunder isn't weather, showed her the low places in the house where walls shake the least, told her again about the sheriff whose patience was a trapdoor. And then they went on planting, because fear is a poor farmer and hope is stubborn. The day trouble chose came dressed like any other, sky high and empty, wind fussing with shirts on the line, beans talking quiet in their rows. That's how fate works out here. It shakes your hand before it breaks your nose. The girl was 12 by then, taller in hope than in height. She moved through chores like she was stitching the world back together. Water here, grain there, a hand on a flank, a word for a skittish hen. The rider watched without watching. Good guardians don't hover. They wait where falling stops. Hoofbeats. Not fast. Fast can be honest. These came measured, like a judge reading a sentence he already decided. Dust lifted in 3 narrow columns. A memory, mean and thin, rode at the front. The rider didn't say the thin man's name. Names feed some men. He just stepped off the porch and stood where the earth was hardest. The rifle leaned by the door. He didn't reach for it. Reaching is a language, and today he meant to speak calm. They stopped at the fence. The law's miles had thinned to thread. The thin man wore 2 years like a shine that didn't take. His eyes were still empty, where decent men keep weather. He smiled the way a trap smiles, with promise, not warmth. "Come for what's mine," he said. "Possession is a dirty word when it touches people. Nothing here answers to you." The rider replied. His voice could have been a bucket of well water. Cool, deep, bottomed out on truth. The thin man talked papers and salvation and second chances, all the currency of cowards who think time erases signatures. The woman who rode with him, same pinched mouth as before, wouldn't look at the girl. The young man, older now, but not wiser, kept worrying his reins like they were guilt he could untie. The girl stood behind the rider's elbow, where a child learns geometry that matters. Angles, cover, distance to the door. She didn't shake. Fear and courage walk together. Courage just holds the map. Fire starts quiet. A word here, a threat there. The thin man's hand drifted toward iron, like a snake finding familiar heat. The rider shifted a half-inch to show he saw it and would answer in kind. Later than most, earlier than some. Then the girl did a dangerous, holy thing. She stepped forward. Not far. Just enough that the thin man had to see her as a person. Not a problem carved to fit his blame. "You left me," she said, voice not loud and not small. "The desert remembers." The thin man laughed the way trees laugh in a dry storm, brittle all noise. Said curses and devils and luck that spoils milk. But his laugh hit the fence and fell apart, because the fence had been built by hands that believed in staying. "Sheriff knows this road," the rider said. "Judge knows your handwriting. Keep moving." He didn't flex, didn't spit, just stood the way a door stands when it's barred from the inside. The young man broke first. Guilt untied him. He turned his horse. The woman followed, relief riding her shoulders like a coat she could finally shrug off. The thin man lingered because men like him worship an audience and hate a mirror. He reached for the gun. The rider reached for the truth. The rifle came up slow, the way sunrise comes, inevitable. And in that slowness was mercy. A last clear chance offered to a man who never took chances that required courage. The thin man's fingers paused. He measured the space and found no purchase. His hand fell. He spat a promise made of mud and went the way wind goes when it knows it's not welcome. After, knees went weak on their own schedule. The rider set the rifle back by the door, touched the girl's shoulder once, light, like thanking a horse for not shying, and fixed a sag in the fence where the moment had leaned too hard. Repairs are prayers you do with tools. The girl exhaled the held breath of 12 years. Then she went to the pump and washed her hands as if to remind them they were made for gentler work. The bucket rang like a bell that knew the right church. Trouble didn't vanish. It never does. It moved out into the scrub to lick itself and plan. But it had learned something vital. This house had a spine, and the people inside it had decided who they were when no one was watching. That night, the lamp burned low and soft. The girl traced letters in her copybook, curves and lines steady as a pulse that finally trusts its own rhythm. The rider mended tack. Each stitch a word he didn't say out loud. Safe. 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 Outside, a coyote sang about hunger. Inside, two hearts answered with work and rest. That's the duet the desert respects. By fall, the ranch had a new corral and a barn that didn't leak apologies when it rained. Calves came on spindly legs, surprised to be here. The girl learned to doctor a scrape and set a splint on a chicken's foolish leg. She talked about being a healer someday, maybe with a town and a sign, maybe without either. The doctor in town said a girl could learn bones and blood as well as any man if books were open the same. The judge said he'd see to the books. Letters from back east kept their pace. The grandmother's words carried a city's music and a widow's backbone. She sent the idea of a future folded into envelopes, schooling, instruments, maps that did not end at the county line. The girl opened each one like a window. On a winter evening so clear the stars rang, the girl asked a question children ask when they're done surviving and ready to live. "Do you think my mama sees me?" The writer looked up where the sky keeps its answers. "If she had eyes once," he said, "she has them still." The girl smiled a small, fierce smile that made the night warmer than the stove. Some warmth travels farther than firewood. Years pass out here the way fence posts pass a rider on a steady trot, countable, then gone. The ranch fattened not on luck but on habits. Early water, clean troughs, tools put back where hands remember them in the dark. The girl grew into her name without letting it grow into pride. She read when chores slept and listened when words needed a place to sit. The grandmother's visits stitched the west to the east with thread that did not break in weather. She brought schools that taught Latin and those that taught stitches, doctors' names and women who wore them. She did not replace anything. She added. Addition is a mercy underrated by poets. The girl's talk turned to bones and blood. Not the spilling, she'd had her share, but the mending. A small clinic behind the feed store began to happen without anyone calling it that. A cut here, a fever there. An old miner's cough eased by steam and time. Dr. Patterson showed her wrists how to be sure and her eyes how to be kind without lying. Kindness that lies breeds trust that breaks. On Sundays, she rode with the rider to the graves that had made room for their names long ago and hadn't needed them. They didn't say the ones they missed out loud in case the wind tried to carry them off. They just stood until standing felt like remembering and went home with silence that settled like a clean sheet. One letter brought a larger choice. A school back east with doors that had learned, slowly, to open for girls who could push with a scholar shoulder. The grandmother offered a place, a chaperone with spine, funds folded without fuss. The judge stamped a paper that said distance is allowed if love travels with it. The porch took that news first. The boards heard the girl say she wanted to go and stay at the same time. The rider heard it too, and did the arithmetic only fathers do. If he held tight, he'd lose her. If he let go, he'd keep her. He chose the loss that saves. The town held a supper and called it a send-off, so it wouldn't have to call it what it was, parting. The storekeeper's wife packed more remedies than cloves. Miss Collins slid a worn book into the girl's hands, the margins fat with the teacher's wisdom. The sheriff, good one now, tipped his hat and pretended his eyes watered from stew onions. The thin man didn't come. Men like him rarely attend ceremonies that aren't about them, but his shadow had grown restless again along the county line. Trouble keeps a calendar. It likes anniversaries. The day before the stage, the girl rode out alone to the place where the desert had tried to keep her. She told the emptiness what it failed to do. She forgave it for being what it was. Forgiveness doesn't excuse. It releases the rope from your own throat. She came back at sunset, face clean of something too old for her years. The rider met her at the corral. They didn't plan words. Words came. Simple. Heavy enough to hold, but not to crush. Night put its ear to their house and listened. Somewhere out in the scrub, a match scratched. The thin man had traded patience for zeal. Men like that burned both ends of their hate. He and two others oiled hinges, whispered bravery at each other in the language of cowards, and took the back path toward a window they remembered. The mare heard first, then the dog no one admitted they owned, then the rider. The click of a rifle's quiet parts sounded like a prayer learned by heart. He moved through shadow as if the night had kept a space for him. The girl didn't hide. She chose where to stand and chose who to be standing there. That's a choice you make once and renew each morning. She picked the kitchen, where knives tell the truth about distance and doors are near. The thin man pushed his luck and a window latch. The rider said the man's name without saying it, with a racking sound that took 10 years to build clean. The thin man froze the way a sermon freezes a liar in the second pew. Law's awake, the rider said to the dark, and we're done being polite to ghosts. A shot would have been easy. Easy's the wrong teacher. Instead, he made the thin man do arithmetic in public. Sheriff at the front in a minute. Judge at dawn. Two neighbors already watching through sights they didn't brag about owning. He laid out consequences like cards and let the man choose a losing hand. The young man with the thin man was older again, and shame had done some honest work on him. He stepped back first, dropped a gun with both hands open so it wouldn't bounce wrong. The woman with them sobbed one dry sob and whispered an apology that blew away, but still did its job. The thin man looked at the girl through the window, saw not a curse, saw himself, small and mean in clean glass. Some mirrors don't forgive. He left. Morning came new and clean, the way mornings dare to, and the stage took the girl east with a wave that was more oath than farewell. The rider stood until dust turned into distance, then went to the pump and washed his hands, because work keeps men from breaking in a loud way, and lets them break in the kind way when no one is looking. The town paused around a missing voice, then learned to speak in the space she left. They would keep a room clean and a place at the table soft. The grandmother's letters would braid the miles into a rope strong enough for both to climb when needed. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.